Well, we were talking about Ten Commandments, obviously, and we're talking particularly about the commandment that says, do not steal. And we were talking about the idea last week, we talked about the idea that when it comes to our relationship with God, stealing is about more than, and in fact is probably not nearly as directed at just money as it is a broader sense of an obligation to sacrifice ourselves to Him. And so when we talk about Malachi, or rather I should say when Malachi talks about robbing God, he is directly addressing tithes and offerings in particular. And you notice he does say tithes and offerings. And so a tithe is, what's the difference between a tithe and an offering? Instead of telling you, let me ask you.
An offering is a free will above. In the old way you had to bring the 10%, but the offering was above that and free will.
Okay. You're mostly right, except there were definitely some offerings that weren't free will, right? I mean, that you had to bring either because you'd sinned or on certain holidays and stuff like that. But most of the offerings, I agree with you, most of the offerings were free will offerings. So what this suggests and what Malachi is saying here is that the 10% tithe is not being given, or is being given with inferior animals and inferior produce, and along with that, that they are either not giving offerings when they're supposed to, or they are giving things that are inferior for their offerings. And so that could be either mandated offerings like ones for sin and guilt, or for other ones that are associated with specific holidays or specific events, or it could refer to free will offerings. Now, how could you be robbing God with a free will offering, which definitionally is something you don't have to give? That seems like kind of an odd concept, right?
Well, you should have.
Okay, so tell me what you mean by that. What's your thinking?
Well, if you have a situation where God has blessed you with something, a new child or new something, and you maybe considered, hey, I need to offer one, but then, nah, I won't. That kind of thing.
Okay, so this is a part of the Old Testament that we sometimes lose sight of, I guess. We get focused on the legalistic aspect of it, and we forget that the core commandments are love the Lord your God and have faith that these things are supposed to underpin. And Jesus talks about these ideas of love and faith underpin the law of Moses. Love for God and love for man, as well as the need for faith and not just a rote following of the law. And so in that kind of a situation, the lack of offerings that are free will offerings would suggest either a lack of love for God or a lack of faith for God, in God, I should say. The same way you might, as you would expect that someone who loved you would do more than just the absolute bare minimum to comply with whatever the expectations were. Someone who loves a thing, I'm trying to think of an example here. Somebody who loves, loves collecting classic cars, for example. It's probably going to do more than just tick off a list of things. I've got to go to an auto show once a year, and I've got to, buy this kind of thing to put on my car once a year. And I've got just, where they're thinking in terms of, here's the minimum I have to do. And so the lack of free will offerings could be indicative of a lack of either love or faith. And that would be a form of robbing God, even if it's not something you've been specified and ordered to actually give, except in the sense of, if you love me, this is something you'll do. If you're appreciative of the blessings I've given you, this is something you'll do. So it suggests someone who either doesn't appreciate their blessings or doesn't appreciate the one who's given it to them.
It's a little bit different, but it is also if you make a promise to God. That's not in the law, but you made it directly with God. Like Hannah did with Samuel, that she gives. She wants a child and she gives the child to him. If she would have withheld that, you know? So, in different things,
That's
if you
true.
make a promise, come through.
Yeah, there was a principle of if you dedicated something to the Lord. Now the Pharisees had begun to abuse that principle by Jesus' time and used that as a way to give something to the Lord without really giving it to him. They were saying it was for the Lord's use, but they were going to keep on using it. So, you know, it's a little bit of an odd thing. I'm holding this in trust for you, Lord, and you can have it right after I'm dead. God's like, thanks. I could rush that if you want. You know, anyway, that's a dangerous thing to say. Go ahead, Linda.
My ESV study Bible note says that when people did not give the tithe, they were keeping wealth that rightly belonged to God.
Mm-hmm. And that's an important thing to understand is several of you I think identified this last week, and it's an important distinction between the Old Testament and the New Testament. That in the Old Testament, the tithe belonged to God. The rest belonged to the person. And anything else you gave beyond that, other than specific offerings that were ordered or whatever, was a free will offering. In our system, under the law of grace, it is a higher standard in one sense, in that God is asking us to give everything to Him, to turn over our lives to Him, and then to let Him decide what we're going to keep and how we're going to use what we keep and that kind of stuff. Which is more difficult, but it fits in with the notion that ultimately we are being transformed and renewed in the likeness of our, renewed in our minds in the likeness of Christ, transformed into His likeness through the Holy Spirit that dwells in us. We're getting something better than just being able to be successful and wealthy and prosperous in the land in which we're at. We're getting something that is a much higher value than that. And so turning over ourselves to Him and sacrificing ourselves is both a reasonable request and also one that has a very logical component. Because if you try to hold on to yourself, it's pretty hard for God to transform you into Christ's likeness. So that the need to let go is a part of our modern, or of the Christian approach. And so that's where we see some of those distinctions. But the underlying principle that we give to God what is God's is even more pressing when we think as Christians, because all of it is God's.
So I get a couple of magazines that I subscribe to, and there's a bill associated with that, and I don't negotiate the bill. It's like, that's what it is, you pay it or you don't get the magazine. And but there's some other things that I do where it's donation based. So I'll have my car washed by some group and they want a donation. Well, usually I pay a lot more for that than what it would cost to go to the car wash, but I think the concept is similar in that a voluntary donation is really the kind of life that we live today. We don't look at it as a bill from God. We don't look at it as a subscription and then we receive something.
Right.
It's a donation, and so we donate our lives freely to Him. To live is Christ. And so we have that concept that we are bought with a price, so we donate ourselves to that cause. And we have the free choice of not doing that, or holding back.
Yes, and we see that in the example, and I'm going to make sure I don't get to this in just a second here, because I don't want to feel stupid if I go over this and then like the next, I'm pretty sure the next slide is definitely not that, but I just want to make sure it's not. Yeah, I don't have it here, so that's good. Because we see that exact principle in the story of Ananias and Sapphira, where, and leading into that, because the Christians, this is early on in the church, and the church is founded on the day of Pentecost and has thousands of members that join that day, and then many more that are joining in the following weeks and months. And the problem is that many of those initial, well, there's a variety of problems. One is that Jerusalem and the region of Judea is a relatively poor area anyway, and with a lot of people in need. But making that far worse is the fact that many of the people who initially joined the church on the day of Pentecost were not native to Jerusalem or Judea. They had come from far away. And we know that because when we think of the initial scene when Peter is addressing the crowd, you get a bunch of different people and they say, we're hearing in our own tongue. And they list off all these different tongues. Well, it wasn't that, Jerusalem was a cosmopolitan city in one sense because of people coming from all over the empire for certain holidays. but they came because they were Jews coming to the, you know, the various feasts, the Passover, the different ones like that. And so these people who are hearing everything in their native tongue, what they're referring to is the fact that they live somewhere else, a long way away in many cases from Judea and Jerusalem, and now they're going to suddenly become Christians, and they didn't leave. That's the reason, in fact, the persecution of Stephen breaks out, in part at least, to make them leave and go back home, because God wanted the church to grow up for a little while and have a chance to be refreshed and close and see the miracles and receive the teaching. But then he needed them to go out, because that's how you spread the gospel. So there's this period of time where you have a whole bunch of people who don't have jobs, they don't have their property, they don't have their assets, whatever they might have been, wherever they came from. That doesn't translate into immediately being able to get a job and a place to live and everything else, just because you came to this new place and you discovered this new gospel and everything. And so the church finds itself in the need of supporting them. And the main way, or one of the main ways that they do that early on, is by members that are local selling property and giving it to the apostles to use to help the poor and those who are in need. And we see Barnabas in particular being referred to as one of the ones who did that. And I don't know, part of the reason they refer to him is because they're kind of, Luke is introducing him for later. But he's also given the title Son of Encouragement. And it seems like, it's almost like they're saying, here's Barnabas, he's called the Son of Encouragement, here's an example of what I'm talking about, So he's the first one who's actually named as actually doing this. But then we transition to the story of Ananias and Sapphira kind of for a counterpoint. And Ananias and Sapphira are members of the church, and they have property and they decide to sell it, but they sell it and they decide to keep some of it back. And it's more about testing God than it is about keeping it back, because they don't tell the apostles. Instead, it appears now that the dialogue with Ananias doesn't actually say this, but when Paul asks his wife Sapphira a few hours later, she affirms what apparently was said, which is Ananias gives it to the apostles and says, I sold the house, my wife and I sold some property, here's all the money we got. And Paul says, you're testing the Holy Spirit of God. That's a bad way to go. You could have kept part of it yourself, or kept all of it if you wanted to, but you lied to God, and you're dead. And and he died. And it said the young men, dragged him out. I don't know if you had a group of young men around just to drag dead bodies off, or what the deal was. It's kind of got a mafia connotation to it almost, when you think about it. It's kind of like, the Godfather or something like that. But then Sapphira shows up a couple hours later, and the same thing happens, and she gets, dragged out too, and wherever they set Ananias, that's where she ends up. But the problem wasn't, and Peter is very specific about this, the problem isn't that they held some of the money back. The problem is that they tried to lie about what they'd done, either, and the scripture doesn't explicitly say why, but it's either because they wanted to test God and see if God knew, or it's because they wanted to get the credit for having done this, and they wanted to say that they sold all of it and get the credit from that standpoint. Yeah?
Question. Is God striking people dead now for the same thing?
I don't think so.
Or
I
is
think
that-
there'd be a lot more dead people.
Right. That's what I'm wondering, because is it like he was just making an example out of them? Like, because sin now still ultimately is a death sentence,
Yes.
but not necessarily
Quite that immediate.
Right. Right. So I'm just wondering. I guess I'm just questioning.
Well, so when we read the scripture a little further, we find that this impact, the effect of the Ananias and Sapphira thing is to cause those who are in the church to have the strength of faith, those who are outside of the church to be in awe and a little bit of fear of what's going on with the church, and those who are claiming to be Christians but really aren't, to get out or get serious about it. So I think that what we're really seeing here is God is making a point very early on that this is real, this is from me, and you don't mess with this. And it has the effect of sharpening the sword in the standpoint of honing down who is going to be part of this to people who are really serious about it. And so you eliminate a lot of sort of the looky-loos and the people who are part of it. And I'm guessing that probably also had two kind of side effects, which is number one, if you're giving to the church, you're not going to mess around with trying to lie about it, obviously. And number two, if you're taking from the church, you're going to make sure that you're in it for the right reasons. Because that logic, or what you observed happen with Ananias and Sapphira, would also presumably extend to misusing the church's resources to your benefit, illegitimately, perhaps. Sylvia?
Ian's question, does God, well, no, he doesn't smite us right away. Yes, like you said, we would have a lot of deaf people, but it has still consequence also today. If somebody is a habitual liar, go look how happy they are, you know, how they live. It has consequences maybe in their health in different ways that just didn't get smitten down.
No. And you know, there is a underlying issue here for us, and that is that the money aspect of it is not the critical thing, as I've mentioned. I think for us as Christians, it's a much more broad spectrum kind of an issue of giving to God generously. And it's important to remember that the modeling for that is the idea of giving up to God what belongs to Him, what He wants us in some ways to set aside so that He can replace that with something better. And if we're not willing to do that, even though there may not be an immediate consequence of death or something like that, in the long run, if we're too determined to hold on to who we are and unwilling to let God change us by giving up who we are, then in the long run, I think that has potential consequences for our souls. It's dangerous to start talking about condemnation in that context, because we don't know exactly where there's no bright line. Well, you didn't give up enough, you're toast. It doesn't work like that, I don't think. But there is an element of, if you won't let God transform you, how do you expect to be anything different? So, Mark, and then I'll go to Jerry.
I was going to say, this to me, a lot of when we're getting taught by God in the Ten Commandments was getting us ready for the new law. Even and especially the Jews, okay, because they're all outward. If you were their thoughts were, if I have all this stuff, then I must be living right because God give me it all.
Yeah.
That's how their thought were, and He wanted them to understand, especially in this, that there's an inward man also, not just an outward that everybody sees. You should be thinking that I need to give more to God because He's given me everything.
Yeah.
And so I am His. So that's the hard thing to break away from. And a lot of this is that training by God by, okay, look, we're breaking you down to get rid of that just not that outward man. You've got to look inside yourself, and when you say, look, I'm going to give this to God, you need to give it to God.
Yeah.
And get your mind set. It's just like when, you shall not kill. But Jesus said, hey, you shouldn't even be thinking about it. You shouldn't hate your brother.
Right.
There's a lot more that instead of that outward. Of course, I'm not going to go kill somebody, but I can hate somebody so much.
Visualize it and walk my way through it.
And that's what He's trying to change our minds, our inward person, to say, hey, we shouldn't even be thinking about it. We've got to live a different life now.
Yeah.
We're Christians. I think that was a lot of it.
Yeah, I think you're right. Jerry?
The author that wrote The Road Less Traveled also wrote a book on the greatest lie. And his position in this, I think, is right along with what you're talking about. He says the greatest lie is narcissism. That you feel that you're number one, and that's it. And there are those that feel that they're strong enough to say they're better than God. And that's his whole premise on the thing is that, and that may very well be the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. It's just that total absence that I am better than God. I know better.
Yeah.
And there are, and I'm sure we've all met people like that, that are that self-centered.
Yeah.
That becomes their life, and nothing is good enough except their idea.
Yeah, that's true. And I certainly, I mean, pride, I think, and narcissism is a reflection of pride. Pride is certainly seems to be at the root of the vast majority of sins, if not all of them, because one of the aspects of pride is that idea that my judgment is the correct one, regardless of what someone else might say, regardless of what nature might tell us, regardless of any of that, what I want and what I'm going to do is more important. And so that is a beginning point for virtually all sin. It's hard to think of any sin really that doesn't involve that to some extent. Or in the case of what we're talking about here, to some extent we're talking about like the free will offerings. Narcissism in that situation, or pride in that situation, just forgets that God had anything to do with blessing me. You know, it forgets that there's a relationship between God and man. And it's important to realize that there's lots of places in the Old Testament, in the law of Moses, where God commanded the Israelites not just to do this and do this and do this and do this and don't do that and don't do that and don't do that. He also commands them how to think about him and to reverence him and to love him and to have faith in him and belief and these kinds of things. Things that we sometimes think are unique to the New Testament, but they were there all along. It's just that we have a much better, I think, understanding of those things through the writings of the New Testament and through the practices. But if you go back and look at the Israelites at their best, or when they are the most mindful of God, they tend to be particularly excited about being, rescued from Egypt, or, being saved by God or called as his people. And they respond to that in a positive way and with outpourings of sacrifice and those kinds of things. And so it's not as though this is a completely foreign concept to them. He's telling them this in Malachi, not saying, oh, here's a new thing I want you to know about. He's saying to them, you know this, do what you're supposed to do. So it's not like he's having to give them where Jesus is saying, here's a new thing. You don't murder, now I'm telling you don't hate. Technically in the law, there wasn't anything quite like that said that was a sin. So in Malachi, God isn't saying anything that's like a new commandment. He is simply reminding them of where they've dropped the ball and the things that they're supposed to do. So we see that principle very much applicable to us today, just as the principle of do not steal more broadly is applicable to us today. And, when we think about this, and we rarely stop and think, am I stealing? Because we tend to think of stealing more than often than not. We think of it in a fairly concrete kind of a way, going into a store and taking something, or robbing someone, or those kinds of things, breaking into someone's home and taking something. And these are obviously the most extreme versions of stealing, where it's, the law is implicated and there's an obvious thing that you've done. But it's important to realize that when God talks about this, when it comes to Christians, there's kind of a two-edged aspect of this. In Ephesians 4, Paul says, he who steals must steal no longer, but rather he must labor, performing with his own hands what is good, so that he will have something to share with one who has need. You see the two sides of that. The first is the negative, do not steal anymore. The second is do something useful, produce something good to share with those who are in need. And so this suggests that stealing or misusing money in a way is a kind of a two-part, or there's two aspects to it. There's taking something that doesn't belong to you, but there's also failure to render up something that should be given or something that should be done. And so someone who is capable of working and producing something useful and good is expected to do that. And the failure to do that is a mirror of the stealing concept. you're failing to live up to what you could do to be helping out and to do more. And so, in Ephesians as well, in Colossians, no, Thessalonians. So I'll get there eventually. We'll work my way through the books. In Thessalonians, Paul specifically addresses, in 1 Thessalonians, he sent them a letter and he said, Jesus is coming soon. And the Thessalonians read there like, woohoo! Quit my job, go up on the roof and wait for Jesus to come back. And so much of the Thessalonians are just good for nothing. They're just hanging out, basically, maybe not on the roof literally, but they're just sitting around waiting for Jesus to come back and being busybodies and talking and not getting anything done. So Paul writes them another letter. He said, listen, when I said Jesus was coming back, I didn't mean to go be a bunch of idiots. Go get your jobs back and work and be useful until Jesus comes back, because you don't know what it's going to be. And he said, and some people are probably going to even die before he comes back, and that's okay, because they'll be taken care of too, don't worry about it. But in the meantime, you need to keep living a life, and you need to keep doing things that are responsible. And so the idea of stealing when it comes to Christians is obviously, yeah, we shouldn't be breaking into people's houses or robbing people or taking stuff from stores or whatever. But we need to think about what we do with our money, with our abilities, with our time, as more than just don't take stuff that doesn't belong to you. And along that line, we need to remember that there are some ways that you can take stuff that doesn't belong to you that may seem kind of okay if we kind of ignore the larger context of it. So one of the things that's interesting in the Old Testament was that one of the things that God talks about when he says when he talks about going and making atonement for stealing, is if he found something that belonged to someone else and didn't return it. And I think that was a really interesting one, because there's a lot of times where in our society, and even among people that I would consider to be people who are Christians, people who are trying to be godly in general, there is kind of this mindset of, if I find something that doesn't belong to me and it doesn't have any obvious indications of who it does belong to, then it's mine, and I'm just going to go ahead and take it, because there's no, obviously, how am I going to figure out who belongs to me? What am I going to do about it? And that happens. I see that a lot at my school, where you have people where something gets left behind in the classroom, and a student comes back. I can't find my earbuds. I left them in the classroom. Well, you're probably not going to find them, because if there's been another class or two in here between then, there's not much hope that you're going to find them, because whoever came across was like, oh look, I found some earbuds. I've got some new earbuds now. Isn't that nice? Jerry?
We found a Bible at Tyler that was a very expensive Bible. It was found, somebody left it propped up against the door of the building. So
Wow.
We looked at it, it had absolutely no identification in it whatsoever. We were willing to give it back to somebody that it belonged to. What do knowing you found that it seems to infer in the Old Testament that you knew that it belonged to Job, but because he lost it, I'm going to keep it. How far do you go with that principle when you absolutely do not know who that $100 bill belongs to?
Well, and I think there's so you transition from one thing to another there at the end, and sort of made it a slightly different question. So let's address the big point in the Old Testament, and then we'll talk about the two different examples you just gave. So in the Old Testament, you're right. By and large, you find an animal, and I mean, if it's maybe a chicken, maybe you don't know, but if it's a larger animal than that, what Jesus says, the shepherd knows his sheep.
Yeah.
And it's pretty easy when you see somebody else's sheep to go, that's not my sheep, that's not my dog, that's not my cow, whatever it is. And at the same time to say, I think that's so-and-so's cow. Because if you know your neighbors, you probably know, most of these people are not fabulously wealthy. They might have a small herd of something. And so the likelihood is, if it's something that belongs to your neighbor, you're going to recognize, this belongs to, as you said, like this is Joe's cow, or this is so-and-so's. And even if you don't recognize it right away, you could, because of the closeness of the communities, you can basically pass word of mouth around. Ryan found a sheep. He's not sure whose it is. If it's your sheep, go talk to Ryan if you're missing a sheep. So it was relatively straightforward to do that. Now, in the case that you started off with the Bible, I think that's relatively easy. If you found it at the church, you just keep it at the church. You make an announcement, we found some Bibles, or if we found a Bible. If nobody responds, then at some point, you know, I mean, the nice thing with this one is the church can kind of hold on to it for a fairly long time before they have to decide what to do. The $100 bill is the real problem. Because you know, if you say, we found a $100 bill, you've basically just handed the $100 bill over to whoever's the least scrupulous among the people that are there when you announce that. You know, you haven't really found the person who it probably belongs to. So,
The best that I found is a quarter.
see, and that's the thing, if you know, but and that's, you know, we hear the thing about Abraham Lincoln, where, you know, walked how many miles it was to return a penny or whatever it was. I think one thing, obviously, we have to recognize is when we talk about what the word in the law is de minimis value, things that have no practical value. We're not talking about that. Nobody these days goes back to find a quarter that they left in the change machine at Walmart or something like that. Once you get into your car, the calculus goes like this. I would have to stand up again, get out of my car, lock the car, walk into the building, hunt through and see if that thing's still there, walk back on my car, get back into it, unlock it, get back into it, start it up again. I'm not doing that for a quarter. That's ridiculous, you know.
It'll be gone anyway.
I know, yeah, it'll be gone, exactly, it'll be gone anyway. I mean, for me at least, by the time I get out the front door, it's gonna take probably $5 for me to go back in there anyway. So the reality, so the point here is, when we're talking about value, and that's a lot of what we've been looking at here. But we're talking about $100, you know. If you find, for example, I have had this happen where at Walmart, I got up to check out and there was, I think, $20 or $40 that had been kicked out of the machine and was just sitting there. And obviously somebody had forgotten to take their change, or they'd asked for cash back and they'd forgotten to get it. Well, that I took and gave to the customer service, because, I mean, yeah, it's possible that the person will never come back for it. And it's possible that the person behind the counter of customer service will pocket it, although the fact that there are cameras there makes that less than likely. But there's at least a possibility that whoever's money that was is going to come back and say, I left my money on this, you know, in a cash register. Well, which cash register did you leave it? This one. How much was it? $40. Okay, well, here you go. We know who this is. And so when it comes to those kind of things, I don't think we necessarily have to give all the information, but we see this sometimes, you know, where you'll hear this, you know, an announcement from in some kind of a meeting, you know, somebody dropped some money. If you can tell me how much it was, then you know, we have it for you here. Generally speaking, you don't go unless it's your money, because you know, especially if it's a church function, you know that if you show up and you're like, yeah, it was $60. And they're like, wrong. Then they think you're dishonest, you know, and so now you've given yourself a bad reputation. So I think that when we talk about things of value, that we need to at least make an effort to either figure out who they belong to or turn them over to someone who will be the most likely place for them to look for those things, you know. If you're walking along the street in the middle, you know, in the middle of a busy highway or something like that, and come across a $100 bill floating across the street, there's probably not much you can do about that. And those kind of situations do exist on rare occasions. But I think that most of us who come across something that didn't belong to us, if we're being honest, would acknowledge that there was something we could have done that would have created a much higher likelihood of that person finding it than putting it in our pocket and heading home without telling anybody, you know. So when we talk about that one does come occasionally. I suspect by now almost all of you in here have encountered some situation where you found something that was lost that belonged to someone else of greater or lesser value, and you have to make a decision. What am I going to do about this? Am I just going to take it and assume that, you know, even if they could somehow prove I did it, that there's no way they can ever really, you know, hold me accountable for it? You know, what's the situation? The other one that I think that we come across, and this one I see. I have seen more Christians have what I would consider a troubling attitude toward, is when there is an error in computation or in change that's made, or in where, you know, you're doing an order and somehow a lower number shows up for some reason or whatever. And then the tendency is that if the benefit is to me, well, if the benefit is against me, then I'm very quick to make sure that the people who are in charge know that I got shortchanged. But if the benefit is to me, then I'm very quick to get out of the store as fast as I can before somebody realizes they've messed up. And the problem, obviously, with that is just another form of stealing when you get right down to it. You're taking something that you know doesn't belong to you. Now, I understand if somebody makes a math error and you're not good at math either, it may take you a while to realize that they gave you too much change, and that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about when you know that somebody gave you back the wrong amount of change. You know that it was way more than should have, or that they forgot to charge you for something that you ordered, that you purchased, some value that you got. I think as Christians, we have an obligation to make that good. Not by criticizing them or making fun of them or whatever, but just by pointing out, hey, you may have missed this or whatever it is. Because, and Barbara will tell you this if she were here, working at a bank. In fact, she talked a little bit about this last week. For people who work in certain kinds of industries, if their tickets or their drawers don't add up at the end of their shift, that can become very, very problematic for them. And if you're a server at a restaurant these days, they use these things called point of sale systems where almost everything you order is tracked by a computer. And that computer knows how much what has been ordered by a table, how much food that's actually going to require ingredient-wise. If beverages have been ordered, particularly alcoholic beverages, keep track of how much beverages should have been served, so that at the end of a shift or at the end of a week, they can go back and check and see, does our inventory line up with what we've got? And so, when a server has X number of things on the tab, and then the tab doesn't reflect that, or when more is served than is shown on the tab, that starts to reflect on the servers. And if we're taking advantage of that and not doing something responsible and the right thing to do about that, we could very easily create problems for someone else. And the thing is, what troubles me is I've heard Christians say things like, oh, it's a big business, they can absorb the loss, it's no big deal. Or it's, they're always taking advantage of us with raising their prices, so it's okay for me to just, get a little benefit here, whatever else it is. But the simple truth is that those aren't really accurate. You don't get to decide for yourselves. There's the joke that, what is it, the shoplifting, was a 3-finger discount or something like that. I forget how many fingers it is. But anyway, I don't know why it's 3 instead of 5, but 5-finger, anyway. Shoplifting is a discount. Well, somebody, a discount, you're stealing from somebody. We all know that. But when you ask someone for something and somehow they ask you to pay less than what you're expected to, and they didn't mean to do that, or you suspect they didn't mean to do that, then you have an obligation to say, okay, wait a minute, you've made a mistake here. And if they say, oh no, I meant to do that, then that's fine, you're good. But if they didn't mean to do that, and they do want you to pay the difference, then you should, because that's the agreement you made.
I was going to say, in Ephesians here, you're thinking only about yourself when you're stealing.
Yes.
You're taking it away from someone else. How can you be even thinking about helping others if that's all you've got, or it's
Right.
about me?
Right.
How can you even share or give to other people if all you're thinking about is yourself this whole time?
And that's an important. We're going to come through and look at next week. We're going to hopefully finish this up. We're going to take a look at more broadly the attitude that Christians should have with regard to money and wealth and that, because I think it's a worthwhile thing to take a quick look at. But when we talk about the stealing aspect of it, it is very much a selfish kind of a thing. And in many cases, when you listen to people who want to take advantage of situations or take advantage of other people, it's almost always expressed in a way that gives an excuse. But at the heart of it, if you distill it down, it's, I just don't really want to have to pay that much, and so if I can get away without doing it, I'm not going to. And I think the other place we come into this sometimes, and this is the one that's going to get in trouble, because we're going overtime, well, not just that, because of what I'm going to say here. I think one of the places we need to be really careful is when it comes to tipping. It's interesting that most European countries don't do tipping anymore. They include the price in whatever the base cost is of what they do, and they pay their employees a living wage, or at least a minimum wage that is as well above what we see in America in general, and specifically in service jobs. The truth is, if you go into a sit-down restaurant, it is a fact that with very few exceptions, the people that are serving you at those tables are being paid significantly less than what the minimum wage is, significantly less than an actual living wage. And if you don't tip them, you are basically undercutting their ability to make ends meet. And that you can say, well, that's not fair, they should pay them as much as they deserve, and they should, the restaurant should pay them a full amount. Okay, fair enough, we can debate social policy on this if we want to, understand that would have the effect of raising the amount of money that you would pay in the restaurant anyway, because that's how a business that had to pay more is gonna make it up. That's what's happening in California right now, that they've raised the minimum wage. So you're not gonna, don't fool yourself into thinking you're gonna get a pass on this because they do it that way. Understand that the situation is what it is right now, and that unless, in my opinion at least, someone is egregiously bad at their job, you need to take that into account in how you pay and how you tip. Because that is something where you can't lie to yourself, not now anyway, because I've told you what the facts are. You can't lie to yourself and tell yourself that that's not really what's going on. That is what's going on. And when that's going on, as Christians, I feel like we have an obligation to do the right thing. I'm not saying we have to tip some crazy amount or something like that, but there are some social expectations of what constitutes a good tip. There are some, some reasonable things. And in particular, if you go in some place and you sit for 4 hours talking and just buy a cup of coffee, you probably need to think about tipping in a way that's more than just reflected by 10% of the cup of coffee or something like that, because you've taken advantage of someone otherwise. And so we need to be mindful about how we treat people when it comes to money, when it comes to things that are more than just, am I stealing directly from them? And think in terms of, am I dealing with other people and if nothing else, we can bring that golden rule thing into it. Am I treating other people the way I want to be treated here when it comes to money and possessions and those kind of things? All right, we got to stop right now because we're way over.